No.
What do the tiny house movement, environmentalism, and Martin Luther King Jr. all have in common? They were all greatly influenced by the same person, Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau has undoubtedly had a great impact upon our society. But before we look at these three things, let's take a tiny peek at who he was and what his influences were. He lived from 1817 to 1862. He was an American author, a naturalist, and philosopher. His works included more than 20 volumes, but he is best known for his book, Walden, or Life in the Woods, and his essay, Civil Disobedience. His influences include his religious upbringing, his family life, the area he grew up in, and the Transcendentalist movement. He was deeply spiritual, he valued simplicity, and he saw God in nature. So what is the tiny house movement? According to the website thetinylife.com, it is defined as a social movement where people are choosing to downsize the space they live in. Typically, house sizes are between 100 and 400 square feet, enabling simpler living in smaller, more efficient space. At the heart of the tiny house movement is the desire for simplicity. This was a theme in Thoreau's life as well. Thoreau may have been the first person to intentionally build a tiny house on Walden Pond, where he chose to live simply in order to live more fully. J. Schaefer, the acknowledged patriarch of the modern tiny house movement, built his first tiny house in 1999. He credits the writings of Thoreau as one of his inspirations. Though a small percentage of the population, the tiny house movement has nonetheless put into action what many of us desire. It has inspired many to eliminate the non-essential in order to more fully experience that which is important. In honor of Thoreau, it also seeks to have less environmental impact and live more in harmony with nature. So how did Thoreau influence environmentalism? He chose to deliberately live in his tiny house on Walden Pond to be closer to nature, to find more of who he was, and to have less environmental impact. As a self-taught naturalist, he advocated strongly that man live in harmony with nature. He believed that man needed to preserve the environment in order to have a place to find himself. In his public speeches, as well as his printed works, he was one of the forerunners of modern conservation. As early as 1851, in a public speech, he declared, "In wilderness is the preservation of the world." This published in 1863 as Walking in the collection known as Excursions. In 1860, in the speech, The Succession of Forest Trees, he analyzed what we now know as forest ecology. He urged farmers to plant trees in natural patterns of succession. Also later published in Excursions, it was a major contributor to conservationist thought. According to the website worldwidewaldens.org, Henry's message of simple, deliberate living, spirituality in nature, and conservation are present throughout his works. Today, Henry is considered among the greatest of all American writers and the intellectual inspiration for the conservation movement. Further, the UC Santa Barbara website states, "The environmental movement has embraced Thoreau as a guiding spirit. He is considered by many to be the father of the environmental movement." So what does all this have to do with Martin Luther King Jr.? Thoreau's belief that man finds himself in nature is born out of his belief that God is in man and God is in nature. As a transcendentalist, he believed in the reliability of the human conscience, due to his belief that God lives inside the soul of the individual. It was this conviction that enabled him to write Civil Disobedience. Its message being, a just man must be willing to be imprisoned for injustices in society. The essay was born from time spent in jail for non-payment of what he considered an unjust tax to be used for unjust purposes. One of Martin Luther King Jr.'s influences was Mohandas Gandhi. More than a generation after Civil Disobedience, Gandhi was inspired by Thoreau to not give up his own nonviolent protest against unjust laws. Gandhi then dedicated his life to the use of nonviolent civil disobedience in order to bring about change in society. Although Gandhi inspired Martin Luther King Jr. with the successes he had with nonviolent civil disobedience, Thoreau was a direct influence upon King in his quest for civil rights for blacks in the United States. King had read Civil Disobedience before he learned of Gandhi, but Gandhi's example served to reinforce what King learned from Thoreau. Following Thoreau's example, King wrote his own treatise while serving time in jail for injustice. It is known as Letter from Birmingham City Jail. King employed the same nonviolent civil disobedience advocated by Thoreau to bring about social change through the civil rights movement. I quote King on Thoreau. During my student days, I read Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. Here, I made my first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance. Fascinated by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system, I was so deeply moved that I reread the work several times. I became convinced that non-cooperation with evil is a moral obligation. No other person has been more eloquent and passionate in getting this idea across than Thoreau. As a result of his writings and personal witness, we are the heirs of a legacy of creative protest. The teachings of Thoreau came alive in our civil rights movement. One can see in these three areas how Thoreau has had a profound effect on our society. His call to simplify life has not only spawned the tiny house movement, but inspired many to live with less in order to have more. His intellectual study and pursuit of nature has empowered the modern environmental movement, giving us much that we enjoy today in nature and wilderness areas. But his deliberate, thoughtful, and personal demonstration of social protest as addressed in civil disobedience has resulted in perhaps the greatest change in our society through influencing Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement.